Zhao Na hadn't always been the kind of person who stood out. She was a nurse at a busy city hospital, and if you asked anyone at the clinic, they'd tell you she was the best one in the ER. Reliable, calm under pressure, and always there to help. There was nothing remarkable about her on the outside: average height, dark brown hair, a face that smiled more than it frowned, but inside, there was a quiet determination that powered her every move. She didn't need to be extraordinary. She was content in her ordinariness. That was before the trial. The experimental gene editing procedure had sounded like a dream at first. A new, cutting-edge program that promised to enhance human abilities, speed, strength, focus, all through genetic modification. She had been intrigued, of course, but hesitant. Who wouldn't be? The ethics of it had bothered her. The thought of tampering with her own DNA, altering what nature had designed, seemed unnatural, but that was before the day her supervisor had walked into the break room with an envelope, offering the procedure as a chance to advance in her career. She could see the possibilities: healthier body, sharper mind. She could work longer hours, deal with the grueling pace of the ER without exhaustion. It sounded like a gift. What Zhao Na didn't know was that the gift would come with consequences far greater than she could have anticipated. The procedure had been straightforward. There was no pain. No complications. They told her she'd feel a little dizzy for the first few hours as her body adjusted to the genetic enhancements: eagle eyes, cheetah speed, and ant strength. 3 animal traits, fused into her genes with the precision of cutting-edge CRISPR technology. The hospital staff had been excited, congratulating her as she lay on the operating table, the soft hum of the lab equipment around her. "You'll feel better soon," they'd said. "It's all part of the process." And they were right. Zhao Na felt better, no, incredible. Within hours, her vision sharpened so much that the tiniest detail became clear. From the chair she sat in, she could read the newspaper headlines across the street. The lines of text in the book on her nightstand were sharp, even in the dark, but it wasn't just her eyes. She felt different, stronger, faster. Her body was alive with potential. She tried to test her new speed the next morning, jogging around the block before work. She hadn't run like that in years. The wind rushed past her, her legs barely touching the pavement, her feet skimming over the ground as if gravity itself were unsure whether it could keep up. She was already halfway to the park by the time she realized she had covered the entire neighborhood. The next day, she woke up with muscles so sore it was hard to get out of bed. But that wasn't what concerned her. What bothered Zhao Na most was the sensation that she couldn't stop moving. Her body itched to run, to feel speed. She had spent hours the day before just feeling her limbs, testing her new abilities. She was addicted to the rush. She had never been so aware of her body, so hyper-aware of every movement, every breath. Every muscle felt alive, humming, as if it were on the brink of something massive. Something uncontrollable. That afternoon, she grabbed a stack of medical supplies at work, one hand full of gauze, the other grasping bandages, antiseptic bottles. It should have been impossible for her to carry all that at once, but it wasn't. Her muscles flexed without strain as she walked through the corridors of the hospital, marveling at how effortless it was to carry so much. She thought she might be able to do this for hours: lift, run, carry, never tire, never stop. There was a euphoria in that thought, but there was also something else, that a gnawing feeling, deep in her chest, that something was off. She should have been tired. She should have felt the weight of the boxes, the strain on her joints. Instead, she felt nothing, only the raw, primal urge to keep pushing. It was when she finally took a break in the staff lounge that she realized what had changed. Her coworker, Lu Xia, sat next to her, nibbling on a sandwich. She asked Zhao Na how she was feeling. "Good," Zhao Na answered, but her voice sounded strange in her own ears. "Too sharp. Too clear, you sure?" Lu Xia raised an eyebrow, glancing at her. "You look a little off. Like you're about to take off and run a marathon." Zhao Na blinked, then laughed nervously, shaking her head. Maybe I will. Lu Xia rolled her eyes. Don't run off too far. We need you here. Zhao Na smiled, but as she looked out the window, she couldn't shake the feeling that Lu Xia was right. She was on the edge of something. But what? She had no idea yet. That night, Zhao Na couldn't sleep. The bed felt too soft, the sheets too heavy. She tossed and turned, her mind racing. She felt like she was vibrating, like there was too much energy in her body to contain. The whole world around her felt too small. She had the sudden, overwhelming desire to run. Before she knew it, she was out the door, her sneakers pounding against the pavement as she sprinted through the quiet streets. The wind hit her face like a slap, but she barely noticed. Her feet flew, her body moved faster than she could think. Her lungs burned, but she pushed harder, faster, until she reached the park, and then, beyond, she ran until the sky started to lighten with the first signs of dawn, her breath ragged but her mind clear. She could hear the world around her with unnatural clarity, the distant chirp of a bird, the rustle of the trees in the wind. The noise of the city seemed muffled in comparison to the sharpness of her senses. Every muscle in her body was primed, alive. She could feel everything, and it felt too good. It wasn't until her feet started to ache that she realized how far she had gone. By the time she returned home, exhausted but exhilarated, Zhao Na's thoughts had begun to unravel. She stood in the doorway of her apartment, panting, her body still humming with energy. This was not just strength. It was something else. Something primal, and that was only the beginning. Zhao Na's initial euphoria over her enhanced abilities quickly gave way to something darker, something more dangerous. The longer she lived with her new body, the more she realized she was losing herself. She couldn't shut out the animal instincts that were becoming harder and harder to suppress. It was as if her very DNA was fighting for control, urging her to run, to leap, to hunt. The lines between her human self and the animals she had inherited traits from began to blur. Zhao Na stood at the edge of a precipice, torn between the promise of power and the creeping fear that she might lose the very thing that made her human. The wild urges were only the beginning, and soon, she would have to face a reality she couldn't outrun, the question of whether she could still control herself, or if the beast inside her would take over. Zhao Na sat on her couch, her body still trembling with a strange, unrelenting energy. She could feel her pulse pounding in her neck, the heat rising in her chest. Her hands gripped the armrest so tightly that her fingers began to ache. Her mind raced, but it wasn't just thoughts flooding her brain. It was instincts, wild, untamable instincts, pulling at her, whispering at her from deep inside. She wanted to run again. She needed to run. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to silence the roar in her head. Her senses, heightened to a terrifying degree, made everything around her seem impossibly sharp: the flicker of a streetlight outside her window, the rhythmic patter of a distant car, the faint scent of flowers from a neighbor's garden. It was too much, all at once, and she couldn't block it out. It was like the world had grown too large, too intense, and she was too small, too fragile to contain it. She took a breath, steadying herself, but the feeling only deepened. Her chest felt tight, as if something inside her was straining to break free. There had been moments, like the one in the ER that morning, when she almost lost control. When she had felt that irresistible pull to leap into action, to crush a piece of equipment with a single hand, or to speed down the hall faster than any normal human could. She could feel it even now, the urge growing stronger. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, interrupting her thoughts. Zhao Na picked it up. It was a text from Lu Xia. You okay? You seemed a little off earlier. Call me when you can. She stared at the message for a long moment. Was she okay? She didn't know. She was afraid of the answer, afraid of what she might say to Lu Xia if she called. If she told her about the way her body felt, about how she couldn't stop wanting to run, to leap, to tear through the city until everything around her was a blur. Would Lu Xia understand? Would anyone? She texted back quickly, keeping it simple, I'm fine. Just tired. A lie. She knew that soon, she wouldn't be able to hide what was happening. She couldn't pretend forever. But how do you explain to someone that your body is no longer your own? That you can't even trust your own instincts anymore, because they're all telling you to do things you don't want to do? She tossed the phone aside and stood, her legs aching from the long run earlier. She'd only barely gotten a few hours of sleep, but that had hardly helped. If anything, it had only made things worse. The exhaustion wasn't physical, it was mental. She was caught in a battle with her own body, a battle she didn't know how to win. The mirror across the room caught her eye, and she turned toward it. Her reflection looked almost the same as it had before the procedure, same face, same dark eyes, but something was different. It wasn't just the physical changes, the sharpness of her vision or the unnatural strength she could now feel in every muscle. It was in the way she looked at herself. Her gaze, now too piercing, too intense, made her seem like a stranger to herself. As if the woman in the mirror wasn't the same woman she had been a few weeks ago, but a different version, a better version, perhaps, but one that she didn't fully recognize. She leaned in closer to the glass, inspecting the fine details. Her pupils were wider than usual, her eyes too bright, almost unnaturally amber in the light. They were the eyes of a predator. The eyes of someone who could see things she wasn't supposed to see, hear things that shouldn't matter. Her gaze flicked to the veins on her neck, which now seemed unervingly prominent, pulsing with a life of their own. Her body was a weapon, and every part of it screamed for action. This wasn't normal. She knew that, but what terrified her more than anything was that part of her didn't want it to be. Part of her wanted to embrace the power, to let go of the control, to unleash the animal inside her. The thrill of it was intoxicating. Zhao Na slammed her hand against the mirror, a sharp crack of sound filling the room. She staggered back, her heart racing as she looked at the small spiderweb of cracks spreading out from where her fist had struck. The force she'd used was instinctive. Uncontrollable. Her breath came in heavy, uneven gasps, and for a moment, she just stood there, staring at the damage she had done. It was just a mirror, but it might as well have been her soul cracking open. She couldn't fix it. Not now. Not with her body in this state. She needed to do something. She needed to control it before she became something she couldn't stop. But how? The hospital the next day was a blur. She was there physically, moving through the halls, tending to patients, performing tasks like she always did. But her mind was elsewhere, trapped in a whirlpool of thoughts, sensations, and urges. The world felt distant, as though it were too quiet, too still for her. She could hear every footstep in the hallway, every conversation in the break room, even the whispers of the machines beeping in the ICU. Each noise was a pinprick, each sound a sharp sting. Every breath, every movement felt too loud, too obvious. Her shift had started hours ago, and yet she felt more awake now than she had when she first arrived. She was restless. Her body kept urging her to move, to run, to leave this sterile environment and race into the night. But she couldn't leave, not now. Not when she was needed. She kept telling herself that. She wasn't a danger to anyone. She wasn't a monster. But that part of her, the part that screamed to leap, to chase, was growing louder with every passing minute. When a trauma patient was wheeled in, a young man who had been in a car accident, Zhao Na was the first to respond. She moved toward him without thinking, already checking his vitals, scanning his injuries. It was automatic now, this feeling of urgency. She worked with precision, her hands steady even as her heart thudded in her chest. And then, in a moment of sharp, terrifying clarity, she felt something she hadn't expected. Her hand, resting gently on the young man's chest, pressed just a little too hard. There was a sudden crack, a sickening, wet sound, and the young man gasped in pain, his eyes fluttering open as he cried out. Zhao Na froze. Her fingers had crushed his rib cage. The sudden realization hit her like a tidal wave. She hadn't meant to, but she had done it. She had hurt him. It wasn't her intention, but the raw, overwhelming power inside her body had surged without warning, and she had no way of stopping it. The room went silent, and for the first time that day, Zhao Na felt truly afraid, not for herself, but for the person lying on the table, for everyone she worked with, for everyone she cared about. She pulled her hand back quickly, but it was too late. She couldn't take it back. The nurse beside her, Mei, gave her a strange look. "Are you okay?" Mei asked, her voice soft, unsure. Zhao Na nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a little tired." But the words tasted false. And deep down, she knew there was no going back from this. That night, Zhao Na didn't sleep. She couldn't. The image of the young man's face, the fear in his eyes, played over and over in her mind. She kept seeing the crack in his ribs, the brokenness of her own control. She couldn't do this. She couldn't live like this, always on the edge of something terrible. Her mind raced with possibilities. What if she could learn to control it? What if she could rein in her instincts, tame the animal inside her? She had to try. There was no other choice. But as she lay awake in the dark, the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, she knew that whatever she tried, it might not be enough. The animal wasn't just inside her anymore, it was becoming her. And that terrified her more than anything. Zhao Na didn't sleep. Not really. Even as her body lay in bed, she could feel the pull of her instincts, growing stronger, more insistent with every passing minute. Her mind was in turmoil, a chaotic swirl of fears, doubts, and the strange, primal urge to run. Her body was restless, every muscle humming with an energy that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her. The sound of her heartbeat was deafening, a constant drum that wouldn't stop, no matter how she tried to ignore it. She tossed and turned, clutching her pillow, burying her face in the cool fabric in a desperate attempt to block out the world. But the world had already changed. It wasn't the same anymore. She pushed herself up from the bed, her movements too fast, too sharp. She couldn't stay still. Her hands trembled as she ran them through her hair, trying to calm herself, but the tension only increased. Her mind kept racing through 1,000 different thoughts, each one as frantic and uncontrolled as the next. What if I hurt someone else? What if I lose it completely? She stood there for a moment, staring at the window, her reflection barely visible in the glass. The city outside seemed so small, so quiet, and yet to her, it felt vast, alive, like the world was spinning just out of reach. She could hear everything: the cars down the street, the soft murmur of the people on the sidewalk, the hum of the buildings themselves. The sounds were so clear, too clear, and every little noise made her skin itch, made her feel like she couldn't breathe. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't stay in this room with the walls closing in on her. Without thinking, she grabbed her jacket and rushed out the door. The cool night air hit her like a shock, and she sucked in a deep breath, trying to ground herself. She had to move. She had to do something before she lost control completely. The streets were quiet, the only sounds the distant roar of traffic and the soft rustle of trees in the breeze. She began walking, her pace quickening with every step. The city was dark, but the moonlight was bright enough to cast long shadows on the ground. Every step she took felt like an echo, like the earth was responding to her, urging her to go faster, farther. By the time she reached the park, her heart was pounding, her breath coming in short bursts. She was running now, the concrete beneath her feet a blur. She didn't think, didn't stop to ask herself why. She just ran, faster and faster, her body pushing itself beyond what was natural, beyond what she had ever done before. The wind in her hair, the rhythm of her breath, the pounding of her feet, it was all she could focus on. She didn't even know how far she went, how long she ran. All she knew was the feeling, the need to keep going. To outrun the world, to outrun herself. Eventually, her body began to protest. The muscles in her legs burned, her lungs screamed for air, but still she pushed forward, unable to stop. She had to keep going. She had to prove that she could control this, prove that she could control herself. But the harder she tried to push, the more the instincts took over. Her muscles were too strong, her speed too much. She could feel the power inside her building, like an untamed force, and the more she resisted, the more it demanded to be released. Her mind screamed at her to stop. But she didn't. She couldn't. With a sudden, overwhelming surge of energy, Zhao Na felt her feet leave the ground. She had no idea how or why, but in that moment, it was as if the earth itself had disappeared beneath her, and she was flying. Her body, light as a feather, soared through the air before crashing down into the grass. She landed with a roll, the impact knocking the breath out of her, but she was up again in an instant, her body already moving before she could even think. For the first time since the procedure, she felt free. Free in a way that terrified her. She could feel the world bending to her will, the power coursing through her veins like wildfire. It wasn't just physical strength, it was raw, unfiltered power, and it was so much more than she could control. Zhao Na stopped at the edge of the park, panting heavily. The ground was littered with broken twigs and crushed leaves from her reckless sprint. Her chest heaved, her breath ragged, but it wasn't enough. She needed to do more. She could feel it in her bones, the urge to go farther, faster, but then, the sharp sound of a voice broke through the haze of adrenaline. Zhao Na. She froze, every muscle in her body tensing. She knew that voice. Lu Xia stepped into view, her face etched with concern. She had been following her, had probably been calling out to her for a while, but Zhao Na hadn't heard her until now. "What the hell are you doing?" Lu Xia demanded, her voice tinged with frustration. "I've been looking everywhere for you. You're scaring me." Zhao Na opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. All she could do was stand there, trembling, trying to catch her breath. Lu Xia took a cautious step forward. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice softer now. "I don't know what's going on with you, but this isn't you. You're not acting like yourself." Zhao Na closed her eyes, the weight of her words pressing down on her. How could she explain this? How could she tell Lu Xia that she wasn't herself anymore? That she didn't know who she was anymore? I don't know, Zhao Na whispered. She shook her head, as if trying to clear the fog from her mind. "I don't know what's happening to me." Lu Xia studied her for a moment, her expression unreadable. "You need to go back home. We need to figure this out, okay? You're scaring everyone." Zhao Na nodded, her body still humming with energy, but she couldn't bring herself to move. She wasn't sure she even could. Every part of her screamed to run again, to leave, but she didn't. Not this time. Lu Xia moved closer, her voice softening. "Come on. Let's get you back." The walk back to her apartment was quieter. The world seemed still now, the rush of adrenaline slowly fading, leaving behind only exhaustion. The urge to run had dulled, but the feeling didn't go away completely. It lingered, deep within her, like a smoldering ember waiting to be reignited. She knew it wasn't over. This, whatever this was far from over. Zhao Na spent the next few days trying to hold on to the fragments of her life, to the woman she had been before the procedure. She tried to focus at work, tried to act normal, but it was getting harder every day. The animal instincts, the overwhelming power inside her, were becoming harder to ignore. Every time she tried to push it down, it only came back stronger. The urges grew more violent, more uncontrollable, until she wasn't sure if she could hold on to her humanity much longer. The worst part was that no one else understood. Lu Xia was concerned, of course, but there was a limit to how much she could help. And the hospital staff, well, they didn't know what to do either. There was no diagnosis for something like this. There were no treatments for genetic alterations gone wrong. She was alone in this, and every day, the animal inside her grew more and more powerful. She had tried everything: medication, meditation, even physical restraints. Nothing worked. It was as if the procedure had rewired her entire existence, leaving her no room for control. She couldn't even look at herself in the mirror anymore without feeling the gnawing fear that she was becoming something else entirely. That night, after a long shift, Zhao Na stood in front of the bathroom mirror again. Her eyes, now almost entirely amber, stared back at her. They were the eyes of a predator. They were the eyes of someone who didn't belong in the world she had once known, and she didn't know if she could stop herself from becoming exactly that. Zhao Na barely recognized the woman staring back at her in the bathroom mirror. The reflection was too sharp, too intense. Her eyes, once ordinary, now gleamed with a golden intensity that made her stomach twist. There was no softness left in her expression, no trace of the woman she had been before the procedure. She was something else now. Something dangerous. She swallowed hard, the weight of it sinking into her chest. The panic, the fear, that she might lose herself completely, it was all-consuming. But no matter how many times she tried to tell herself it wasn't too late, a part of her didn't believe it. What if she couldn't control it? What if this was her new reality, this feeling of power and rage that simmered just below the surface? Her reflection flickered in her vision as her enhanced eyesight caught the smallest detail, the minute imperfections in her skin, the rapid pulse beneath her neck, the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers flexed as though itching to do something, to move, to break something. You need to stop, she thought, clenching her fists, before it takes over. The problem was, she didn't know how to stop. Lu Xia had been worried when she had found her in the park the other night. She could see it in her eyes. But that concern was fleeting. Zhao Na had barely returned her calls after that night. She knew what Lu Xia would say now, that it wasn't too late, that she needed help, that she could find someone, anyone, who could fix it. But Zhao Na couldn't face anyone. Not when she was like this. Not when she was becoming something other. The worst part was the animal instincts inside her were growing stronger with each passing hour, nudging her in directions she couldn't control. They whispered to her, constantly. They urged her to run, to hunt, to destroy whatever came in her path. The power of the eagle's vision, the agility of the cheetah, the raw strength of the ant, all of it had come so quickly, had been injected into her body so fast, and now she could hardly stand the stillness of normal life. It felt unnatural to simply walk down the street, to sit in her apartment, to be still. Control. It was the only word that held any meaning anymore, but it was slipping away, like sand through her fingers. She had been trying to live a normal life, trying to pretend that she wasn't a ticking time bomb. But every time she stepped out into the world, she felt the pull of something darker. Something primal. The world was too slow, too dull, and she could feel the friction, the discomfort of it all. Every conversation felt like an interruption, every movement of the people around her too slow, too clumsy. She was always on the edge of snapping, always 2 seconds from letting everything go, and she couldn't stop herself. Zhao Na's shift at the hospital was like any other, except it wasn't. Every patient, every task, every word from a colleague sent her deeper into a state of hyper-awareness. She saw things others didn't, the faintest change in a patient's breathing, the rapid rise and fall of the chest, the subtlest shift in a muscle's tension. It was all there, visible to her, almost painfully so. Her hearing was heightened too. She could hear the murmur of voices in distant rooms, the soft hum of machines, the quiet footsteps of the staff in the hallway, and the worst part? The instinct to act on it. The urge to move faster, to step in and do more than she should. She was constantly holding herself back, fighting the drive to become the animal she could feel crawling just beneath her skin. During lunch break, she found herself in the hospital's small cafeteria, staring blankly at her tray of food. The sandwich looked bland. Lifeless. Her appetite had been waning for days now. But the worst part was how she could feel every single crumb of it, the texture, the taste, the way it slid down her throat. It was so slow. Too slow. She pushed the tray away, not caring when it clattered against the metal table. Her head was pounding with a strange, pulsing pressure. She could almost feel the thrum of her blood in her ears. She rubbed her temples, trying to calm herself, but nothing worked. Nothing ever worked. It was like the energy inside her was becoming too much, threatening to break her apart at the seams. "Zhao Na," a voice interrupted her thoughts. She looked up, her eyes narrowing as she registered Mei standing in front of her. "You okay? You've been acting a little strange lately." Zhao Na's lips pressed into a thin line. She forced a smile, but it felt wrong, as though it had been painted on. "I'm fine. Just tired." Mei didn't look convinced, but she didn't press further. "You've been looking a little pale," she said with a frown, concern still lingering in her voice. "Maybe you should take the rest of the day off." Zhao Na forced another smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine. Just a little off, I guess. I'll be okay." She couldn't bring herself to say more. The last thing she wanted was for anyone to know what was really happening to her. She didn't even fully understand it herself. The changes had come too fast, too aggressively, and now she was terrified. What if it was too late to fix? What if there was no way back? What if the person who used to be Zhao Na was already gone? That night, Zhao Na tried again to sleep. She closed her eyes, hoping to escape the madness of her thoughts, but all she could hear was the pounding of her heart, the hum of her breath, the ringing of her heightened senses. She tossed and turned, the bed sheets twisting beneath her, but the discomfort only deepened. She was suffocating. It wasn't just the physicality of the transformation, it was the mental weight, the constant battle against herself. Her body was pushing her to become something else, something she didn't want to be, and she didn't know how to stop it. She didn't know if she could stop it. Suddenly, she sat up, gasping for air, her hand clutched to her chest. She could feel it, the animal instincts rising again, pushing at the edges of her control. It was becoming unbearable. Without thinking, she stood, her legs already moving before her brain could catch up. She needed to run. She needed to escape. She threw open the door, not bothering to grab her jacket, and rushed down the stairs, her feet pounding against the pavement before she even realized it. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't care. The wind whipped through her hair, the world blurring around her as she ran faster, faster than she'd ever run before. Her senses were on fire, the air felt electric, the world sharp and vibrant. Her body surged with a strength she couldn't contain. She pushed herself harder, the need to move becoming a desperate thing, a part of her she couldn't outrun. Her heart raced, the pulse of her blood deafening in her ears. She ran through the streets, her legs carrying her further than she ever thought possible. It wasn't enough. She needed more. The world, once so dull, now seemed too small, too slow. She needed to break through it, to push past everything, and then, just as quickly as the impulse had struck her, she was falling to the ground. She barely registered the impact. The force of it left her breathless, her muscles shaking from the exertion. She lay there for a moment, struggling to catch her breath, to slow the wild pounding in her chest. It wasn't until she heard the faintest sound of someone approaching that she forced herself to sit up, wiping the blood from her hands. She hadn't even realized she'd cut herself. A figure emerged from the shadows, and for a moment, Zhao Na felt a flash of panic. But then she recognized Lu Xia. "Zhao Na." Lu Xia's voice was quiet, but full of concern. "What are you doing? You can't keep running from this. You can't keep running from yourself." Zhao Na's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Lu Xia, really looked at her, and for the first time in days, she felt something other than the desperate need for escape. She wasn't sure what it was, relief? Regret? But it didn't matter. What mattered was that she couldn't do this anymore. I don't know how to stop," Zhao Na whispered. Her voice cracked as the truth came tumbling out. Lu Xia stepped forward, kneeling beside her. "You don't have to do this alone. Let's figure this out together." Zhao Na closed her eyes, the tears threatening to spill over. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe she wasn't completely lost. But deep down, she knew that even with help, she couldn't undo what had been done. The animal was inside her now. And no matter how hard she tried, it would always be there.